Well, so today's topic is about pleasure and why it's really, really important that we actually start to really pay attention to pleasure, to study pleasure, and to learn about pleasure. Now, being someone who more or less comes from the so-called, let's say, the Occidental culture, the culture of the so-called West, I've grown up in a culture that is essentially Christian, and that going back for generations and generations, the idea that pleasure, the flesh, sex, sexuality, and so on are somehow sinful, and that actually we should more or less be sort of trying to sort of emanate this life of suffering as like a good life, right? And it's kind of left this imprint on our society that actually is really harmful. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a true believer that we need to experience pain, we need to suffer. This is part of life, whether we want to say fortunately or unfortunately. I do think pain actually amplifies our ability to experience pleasure. However, there's plenty of pain around, and I don't think we need to actually, put ourselves into painful situations in order to experience it. We just need to, experience it fully, the pain that we have, and learn to process it. However, pleasure is really, really important. And I'm not talking about just chasing pleasure without accepting the other parts of life. Absolutely, we need to accept emotions that perhaps may be a little unwelcome at first in order to experience our pleasure. But what I notice going on is there seems to be this mad chasing of pleasure, and yet it's like people are chasing pleasure but not really getting it. So if you look at, for example, advice being given by most sex coaches that you find on Instagram, you're finding all this stuff like the kink thing is like a massive fashion at the moment. So sort of the idea that perhaps you need to have somebody sort of spank you or pee on you or strangle you and so on in order to really experience pleasure, that this is kind of like the only way. Or another idea, certainly it comes across in porn, is this whole idea that you need to have like, a massive sex toy or a massive cock and a really, really hard pounding in order to experience pleasure. But I just see a lot of this, it's really coming from like an ignorance about the actual nature of pleasure. Now, I am a great example of someone who grew up with no clue about my own body and no clue about pleasure. I wanted pleasure. I remember being a teenager and going to raves, taking ecstasy, having sex. And obviously I was chasing pleasure, but I wasn't getting pleasure from it. And I didn't even realize I wasn't getting pleasure, because the thing was, I didn't know anything about my body. I didn't understand my body. And the truth is, I was actually afraid to explore my own body. And in terms of my partner, that he just didn't know. So we were just kind of trying to copy this kind of idea of sex that seemed to be, the guy kind of puts it in, jerks around a little bit, and then comes. It was only, I think, when I was around like 21, that was the first time I realized that actually me as a woman, I was also supposed to be having orgasms. I didn't even realize, I was supposed to be having orgasms. I hardly knew what my clitoris was. And to be honest, I didn't even like being touched there. It was too oversensitive. And I certainly didn't know anything about my G-spot, my cervix, or really understand anything whatsoever about internal pleasure. So when I realized like I wasn't having orgasms, I went off on this mad search, which obviously it took me to Mantak Chia, it took me to Taoism, it took me to Tantra, and to just general like journey into conscious sexuality and learning to understand my body. Now, when I look back on the sex that I had before I understood about this, now this might sound like a really harsh thing to say, but it's almost like all the sex I had before, it was literally like, and to take responsibility myself, through my ignorance, I was literally allowing myself to be abused. I would almost use the word raped, because there was nothing going on that was actually about my body. My body was not in consent with what was going on. My body was not enjoying what was going on. I was confused. I was even afraid. I was thinking, I'm supposed to do this. I'm supposed to be like this. But I just didn't really understand at all, about about my body and about my own pleasure. So it's not even my brain may have been saying yes, but my body was actually saying no to what was going on. And that's why I wasn't having an orgasm. Now, the feminist Germaine Greer, who seems to be quite controversial, but I do like some of the things she says. And she said, bad sex is worse than rape, or at least it's as bad as rape. And I can definitely see what she means, because repeatedly having like bad sex, and that is something we all need to take responsibility for and change. It's not one person's fault or another person's fault. And I definitely think looking at this in terms of fault is like really, really not helpful. But we actually all need to really start taking responsibility for our own bodies, looking inside and really seeing, what do I want? What does my body want? Look, nobody is going to find out about pleasure if what's going on is that the woman is bending over, the guy is going in the back and going whack, 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 whack until he comes. How can that even touch any of the female pleasure zones? Plus, if you go over these spots fast, they don't work, they don't activate, you don't get the feeling. It's literally by slow touch, and preferably with fingers, not even a sex toy, but actually with fingers, that you could very, very gently, and I'm talking about this kind of touch on the G spot, the bottom, on the K spot, the U spot. This is basically how we start waking up to our pleasure. And the same goes for men. And I really feel quite sorry for men, because there's this whole idea that men are supposed to know everything about sex. Of course they don't. How are they supposed to know? All the information they're being given, really, quite frankly, is actually like misinformation. And they're basically being put in this position and just having like a really difficult time, really, really stressing out, really kind of getting adrenalized. And actually, yes, I mean, and obviously it is going to be men in this case getting the blame more for date rape, because it's them going inside their woman's body. But there's also women out there that have no idea about consent, that are doing stuff to men that men don't consent to as well. And it's just all a big sorry mess. And when you see at statistics around, for example, anorgasmia for women is in epic numbers. You look at premature ejaculation, it's massive, massive problem for guys. Again, erectile dysfunction. And this is all to do with basically the fact that we don't actually know what we're doing with our sexual organs, and we're just pounding and banging these very, very delicate parts of people's bodies. And then rather than going in to try to find our pleasure, we're looking out for outward stimuli like porn, like kinks, like just things that aren't actually, multiple partners. Polyamory is a really good example. So I'm not getting pleasure with my partner. Well, if I go off and sleep with other people, I'm just going to keep on making the same mistakes that I made before, aren't I? There might be a big rush of hormones in the beginning, but it's not actually solving the initial problem of like not understanding pleasure, not knowing about pleasure, and not basically, going in and discovering and learning to discover pleasure. So ultimately, for both males and for females. And I see this like with so many of my clients when I both teach people how to massage their own sexual organs, when I give Taoist tantric bodywork to people, which involves, amongst other things, touching and massaging of the sexual organs in a way to unblock energy. And people just are like, wow, I never knew that gentle touching, that even touching in parts of the body I'm touching, that they can feel like so amazing. And we have all this amazing, amazing pleasure hidden inside our bodies. But ultimately what we need to do, we need to slow down. We need to go inside, and we really, really need to just start to breathe, because without the breath, without the slowness, without really being present in the moment, without really being present in our bodies, we're just going to miss the energy. We're going to miss the pleasure. And it's like we're just chasing something which we're never ever going to catch, because it will always be one step ahead of us unless we really sink into it and start to feel it.